Okay, so footnote 29, there's a tab, if you will, on page 9 that says controversy, sons of God, angels, men, or misinterpreted. And we've talked about them a bit leading up to this point. And I'll just reference an article on the Janus Project blog written in April of 2013, or at least posted there.
What should we be writing down?
Okay, so I want you to read the article that's shared on EndNote 29. So that's the link to how to find the article. I just looked, it's still there. Mainly because I haven't taken my blog down. Where? So my blog is still there.
It's on page 28, but it's page 29.
Yes.
Oh, gotcha.
All right. So there's the view, and so it's something we're going to lead up to. We probably won't have time to get into today, but I want you guys to kind of be ready for a discussion on it tomorrow. So I would like you to read that article, and again, EndNote 29 on page 28 will lead you to the link. Let's take a look at the notes. We're going to finish up the last bit here, and then we're going to be done for the day. Seth's line. Okay, so in Genesis 4:25, we start getting a trace of Seth's line going forward throughout history. So pretty much all of Genesis chapter 5 is going to be the descendants of Adam all around. Genesis chapter 4 is a ton of Cain's line, but at the very end of chapter 4 it says this, and Adam knew his wife again. She bare a son, called his name Seth, for God said she hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel whom Cain slew. And to Seth, to him also there was born a son, he called his name Enoch. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Okay, now compare this with verse 16 of the same chapter, and it says, Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod. And so there seems to be a connection between these two, where in the one case, here's got a guy who's calling on the name of the Lord, and on the other case, you got a guy who went out from the presence of the Lord. And so there's a definite connection there. Now, as we continue, his son's name is Enos, and it comes from a word that means weak, frail, or faint, which is interesting. It could be that it's kind of implying the state of humanity and how they are becoming weak, frail, and faint. Anyway. Verse 26 says that, then man began to call upon the name of the Lord, and it seems that at this point men began to call on the name of Jehovah. Specifically, the word for Lord there is Jehovah. So it may be that they're calling on, God's name as more than just the God, but they're actually on a more personal relationship with him. Some of this is interesting because there's certain names for God that won't be revealed till later. So there is some debate on how this all works out because, again, when Moses later on asks, like, how will they know you sent me? He's like, well, tell them that I am. And so there seems to be some sort of special attachment to this name I am, which is Jehovah. And so that's specifically the name that they're referencing here. And so there seems to be some significance to the fact that it's Jehovah's name. Humanity spreads out. I don't know if that answered your question, Zach, that you had referenced.
Yeah.
Okay. So the reason I bring that up is because as you go through the rest of chapter 5 into chapter 6, there seems to be this large turning away from God for the most part. And so there could be some significance to the wording here. All the human history from Adam to Noah is given in chapter 5. And again, following off of chapter 4, let's just read it without the chapter breaks. You just came off of all of Cain's descendants, and it says, verse 25, and Adam knew his wife again. She bare a son, called his name Seth, for God said she hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. And to Seth, to him there was also born a son, he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. This is the book of the generations of Adam. What do you notice?
It's a pretty
Toledot.
Toledot. It's a division here. So, since a lot of times this comes at the end of a section, it really could be that this is summarizing. It's either summarizing the previous section or about to introduce. It really fits either way because the whole next chapter is Adam's generations. So kind of both of these chapters were, but look what it does. Chapter 5, this is the book of the generation of Adam. In the day that the Lord created man, in the likeness of God made he him. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, called their name Adam, in the day that they were created. And Adam lived 130 years, and begat a son in his own likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth. So it has been a long time. So remember, the whole Cain and Abel thing, so you've got Adam coming off of creation, and you've got 130 years. And this is when Seth is born. Okay? So it seems, the way the narrative is staged, it seems like Cain and Abel happens sometime in this region right here. So let's say, we'll just throw out 20 years. All right? And so most of chapter 4 could take place within those 110 years where Cain's been exiled for that amount of time. It doesn't seem unreasonable. It's not saying that Adam only had one other son, and so basically it was Cain and Abel here, and then he waited because, like we said, there need to be other people. All right? And so most likely there's a lot of kids being born in this 130 years. And it goes back to, he's 130 years old when he has Seth, so that means there was something different about how they worked back then. All right? And so if you look, it says Adam lived 130 years. He begat a son in his own likeness after his image and called his name Seth. So there seemed to be something special, probably more than just he looked like Adam. There seemed to be something more in kinship with who Adam is. All right, now we continue, and it says, and the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years. So this is where we get the idea, okay, 800 more years, and then Adam dies. So he dies, if we want to call this, he dies at 930 AC, standing for after creation. Okay? So just to put it in perspective, because there's a lot of times where there's overlaps and we don't pick up on the fact that, oh, Adam's still alive at this point. Look what it says. And the days of Adam after he begat Seth were 800. He begat sons and daughters. And all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Now, Seth lived 105 years, and he begat Enoch. Okay? And so Seth is going to live 105 years. Okay? And he's going to have a child by the name of Enoch. All right? And it says this, that after Seth begat Enoch, he lived 807 years. Okay? All right, and so you do the math, because I'm rapidly going to forget how it all worked. So what? Well, he lives a long time, but you add the 930 to the 807, and then you add that to the 105, and that gives you how many years after creation he lived. When you start doing this math, you start finding out that's kind of how we figure there's about 2,000 years. He lives 105, begats Enoch. Seth lived after he begat Enoch 807 years, and he died, and he begat sons and daughters. All the days of Seth were 912 years. So 912 plus the 130, that's where you're already over 1,000 years after creation. So that's quite a long time. All right? So just with these two guys, you're looking at 1,000 years plus after creation. Pretty impressive. Like, that's one old dude. All right? He saw some things. Okay? It says this, Enoch lived after, so Enoch, he lives 90 years. He has a child named Canaan. Enoch lives after he begat Canaan 815 years, begat sons and daughters. All the days of Enoch were 905 years, and he died. Canaan lived 70 years, begat Mahalalel. Canaan lived after he begat Mahalalel 840 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Canaan were 910 years, and he died. And Mahalalel lived 60 years, and begat Jared. And Jared lived after he, so on and so forth. You get the picture. All right. And it says, if you hop down, Jared lived, Enoch, so on. Verse 21, and Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. Now here's what's interesting. The name Methuselah, roughly translated, is when he dies, like it will come. Like there's almost an implication by the wording of his name that something bad is going to happen when he dies. I find it interesting because like right after Methuselah is born, it says, and Enoch walked with God. After he begat Methuselah, 300 years and begat sons and daughters. So he's actually the youngest like patriarch because he only lives, a few hundred years. All the days of Enoch were 365 years compared to everyone else who lived like 900. No wonder this dude, he's like a little child. And it says Methuselah lived 107 years, begat Lamech. Methuselah lived after he begat Lamech 782 years and begat sons and daughters. What's interesting to note is Methuselah dies the year of the flood. So it's kind of cool. So Methuselah is going to carry on through the lines of all these other ones. He's going to survive all the way up pretty much until the year of the flood. So just kind of an interesting connection. Let's kind of look at this now that we've read it through. Corruption of humanity and subsequent judgment of the flood is described in chapter 6. But look at this. There are about 10 generations. It traces from Seth down to Noah. Other branches don't really matter to the narrative. We've already covered a bit of them through Cain, but there's obviously plenty of other people being born at this time. There's plenty of other descendants. The population of the earth would have been booming. There would have been a lot of people probably. All right, Adam, the name signifies earth. That's literally, because he's made of earth, so Adam, reminding Adam from whence he came. The same name is given to Eve. Like I said, that's how chapter 5 works. So Adam and Eve are both treated as Adam. Adam lives 30 years. Now, the Septuagint gives it a wrong number of 230. And again, this is observing some specific offspring, not Adam, 130. Yeah, let me double check that. Yeah, 130. Okay, so the Septuagint is going to give you a slightly different number when you read it. The Septuagint, again, being the Greek translation. So that's another reason why we don't just jettison everything, because the Septuagint reads that way. There are times where the New Testament seems to quote the Septuagint, or the Septuagint was made to match the New Testament's Greek. It's another topic altogether, but we don't just readily drop everything because the Septuagint says it, because the Septuagint gets it wrong here. All right, so Adam lives, make sure that says 130 in your notes, just in case. This again is observing just specific offspring. I don't think Adam waited 130 years to have another kid. I think there were a bunch of kids, and the Bible's specifically picking one of them to say, we're going to follow this guy. The image of God is still there. It's degraded, and so perhaps that's why it's saying that Seth is in the image of Adam. So just to kind of remind us, it's not the purest thing right now, but it's still there. So there you go. So chapter 5 is all about the descendants of Adam, leading from Adam down to Noah. As you understand, there are other people living, and there seems to be a godly line that's carried down through to Noah. The Bible still says that Noah is someone who will find grace in God's eyes, so we don't know how perfectly they did the right thing. In fact, as you can see, when it gets to like Enoch with Methuselah and stuff, it talks about him walking with God after Methuselah was born. So there seems to be some sort of like, he wasn't really doing right. But when your son's name basically means something bad's going to happen when he dies, you probably are going to pay attention. Okay, some other notes. John Gill, he's an he's an old commentator, and he writes this. He says, in his own likeness, after his image, not in the likeness of image or God in which Adam was created. He says this, having sinned, he lost that image, or at least it was greatly defaced, and he came short of that glory of God and could not convey it to his posterity. Conceived in sin and shapen in iniquity, are polluted and unclean, foolish and disobedient, averse to all that is good and prone to all that is evil. The sinfulness of nature is conveyed by natural generation, but not the holiness and grace. That is not of blood, nor of the will of man, nor of the flesh, but of God, and is produced of his own will by his mighty power, impressing the image of his Son in regeneration of his people, which by beholding his glory, they are more and more changed into that image by the Spirit of God. So John Gill makes the point to say, Adam passed on his physical image, but as far as the spiritual, like we are the image bearers of God, it's so stained at this point that it's just kind of stated, you're in the image of your Father, not of God. Again, that brings us back to the discussion of what the image of God is. I believe the image of God has more to do with our responsibility to be God's representatives on earth. And so we damage the image of God in how well we steward. and represent God here on earth. So obviously some people, I think, do a better job of it than others. But anyway, just a thought. Okay, continued chronology. Adam lives another 800 years. This one, the Septuagint changes to 700 since they got the 130 year wrong earlier. So Septuagint kind of, so again, that should be 130. So the Septuagint will say that Adam was 230 and then that he lived another 700. The Bible is going to say he was 130 and lived another 800. So just to kind of give you an idea, the Hebrew Old Testament and the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament, are going to read differently. All right. We don't know how many other children. Some say 30, some say 100. Again, it's all guessing. There's just no way to know. But again, Hebrew scholars try to come up with answers for everything. So there's a lot of stuff that was passed down traditionally. We have no evidence it comes from this time. So we've already talked about the days, but months and years are reckoned differently as well, sometimes in the Bible, because they're not based on precise calendars that we use today. So some of them are based more on a 30-day month rather than a maneuverable, you know. So there are some things where if you start trying to do the math, it doesn't come out exactly, but if you do it with a 30-day month and there's 12 of those, then it's 360 days. Sometimes the numbers work out and you're like, okay, that's the calendar they were using. So if you ever have a problem and you're really sitting down trying to work with endless genealogies, which the Bible warns about, and he died. That you're going to see that a whole lot. Seth is going to live 105 years, have Enoch. Seth will live another 870 years. Again, the Septuagint's going to get this number wrong again. It's going to add 100 and then subtract later. So the Septuagint kind of, you're going to see a consistency of the Septuagint kind of getting these numbers wrong. So altogether, Seth is going to live 912 years, and he died. All right, verse 8, according to some Arabic writers, Seth invented the Hebrew letters and begged his children not to descend from the mountain where they dwelt. This is a weird one. This is where some people are going to say, like, you have the godly people living up in the mountains and the ungodly people living in the valleys. And as you see in chapter 6, it's going to start talking about the sons of God coming down to the daughters of men. So that's kind of the grounding for where they're like, these aren't angels, they're people who are godly, living in the mountains, coming down to marry women of all they chose. So I'm saying that to kind of lay the groundwork for what we're going to discuss tomorrow. But that's where it comes from in a way. This was, according to those writers, to prevent them from mingling with the descendants of Cain who lived in the valley. I don't know. All right. Verse 9, Enoch is going to live 90 years. He's going to beget Canaan. Again, Septuagint does its thing again. Verse 10, lives another 815 years. Septuagint, 715. You get the picture. Septuagint keeps messing up by 100 years. I don't know why. Altogether, he's going to live 905 years and he's going to die. A very simple explanation for some of these numerical problems. I realize I just said I don't know why, but here's a theory. They don't necessarily use the number system like we do. Sometimes they had symbols for it. Sometimes they had certain letters that represented numbers. And so if you misread some of those numbers, or if the number gets added or something, it's not like us where it's like 100. Like they're using symbols, and this symbol could mean 100, this symbol could mean 20, this symbol could mean. So depending on which symbols you put together, you might get a different number. So that's where some people kind of chalk up some of these numerical errors in the Bible. Like translation wise, it could be they're translating the symbols wrong and they're giving it more or less than they thought they were. So the other explanation comes from a book that I'm going to give any of you who don't already have it. Again, according to the Arabic writers, he exhorted his offspring not to intermix with the line of Cain. So Arabic writers kind of shed light on this, whether they're right or not. Verse 12, Canaan lived 70 years. He begets Mahalalel. Again, Septuagint adds 100 as always. According to the other Arabic writers, he also did the same thing to plead with them not to go into Cain's line, and he dies. All right. We're going to move a little faster because you're getting a pattern here. All right, verse 15, Mahalalel lives 65 years, begets Er. Septuagint adds 95 years this time. All right, lives another 830 years, lives 895 years total, according to the Arab writers, told his descendants not to descend the mountain and mix with the line of Cain. Verse 18, Jared lives 162 years. have it right for once. It lives 800 years. Septuagint has the same, and there's a Samaritan translation that gets it wrong. Verse 20, he lives 962 years total and dies. The name of this patriarch means descending, which according to Arabic writers, during this time Seth's descendants began to come down out of the mountains and intermix. According to writers, so Gill's commentary is going to bring this up, Genesis 5:20. He called to him Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, and their children, and challenged them to take care of their purity and not descend from the mountain. So, again, these writers who are talking about this are continuing to bring up this idea. This is why I bring it up, because now you can see kind of where the roots of some of these ideas come from. We've got to be very careful when we talk about things that are not in the Bible. Because there are all sorts of ideas for like, well, there's this idea and there's that idea, and with this could explain this way. We've just got to be careful. We don't know, all right? If the Bible didn't see fit to give it to us, we've got to be careful that we don't read into it to the point where we're being dogmatic and making things up, all right? Because there are times where you get some weird stuff, specifically in some of the Jewish writings. There's some really weird stuff, like Adam had another wife before he had Eve, and it was weird.
That wife ate of the tree,
You know.
but Adam didn't.
Well, she was kicked out for other reasons, and so she basically became a demon, and
Cool.
you know, all that. And you're kind of like, okay, sure. So there's a lot of weird stuff. A lot of it comes from kind of Hebrew mythology that kind of tries to shed light on the Bible. So just be careful. Verse 21, Enoch lived 65 years. Methuselah's name means, when he dies, there shall be an emission, which basically means there's going to be judgment. All right. But again, Enoch's going to live another 300 years. Enoch's entire life was 365 years. So Enoch was not, because the Lord took him. And again, we don't have record of his writing anything, but there are prophecies given. Let's look at one of these. If you look in Jude chapter 1, because there's no other chapter.
Where's Jude?
Okay, so Jude is this tiny little book squished right before Revelation, and it's exactly one chapter long. And if you look at verse 14, it says this, and Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment upon all, and to convince all the ungodly among them of their ungodly deeds which they have ungodly committed, and all their hard speeches which ungodly sinners have spoken.
They're ungodly.
So, apparently, Enoch said this at some point. Now, there is also a non-canonical book called the Book of Enoch. And there's also one, the second book of Enoch, I think, that would have been around at the time of the New Testament. It's not canonical because we have no proof Enoch actually wrote it. That is most likely the document that Jude is quoting from, but he's quoting it, and apparently God is putting his stamp of approval to say at least that chunk was actually a prophecy that Enoch actually said. So somehow, some of the stuff that Enoch said was preserved all the way up until the New Testament times, which would have been quite a bit of time. And he's talking about judgment and God pouring out his wrath on people and ungodly people and all this stuff. So, but again, it's not necessarily, in my opinion, God putting his stamp of approval on the entire book of Enoch. It talks about some weird stuff. It's a quick read, but it's interesting stuff. It has a lot to do with angels coming down and doing things. And so we'll talk about it tomorrow. All right. But again, there is more than one book ascribed to him. So there's the book of Enoch, which describes angelic watchers coming down to earth and teaching mankind things. There's no evidence the books on Enoch were actually written by Enoch. But the quote from Jude is from the book of Enoch. So whether the book of Enoch and Jude both got it from the same source, which is Enoch, or whether Jude is quoting the book of Enoch and just saying this part of it is true. So there you have it. All right. Methuselah will live 87 years, begat Lamech. This is a different Lamech than would have been seen otherwise. This is not the same of Cain's descendants, obviously. Methuselah will live 782 years more. He lives a total of 969 years, and then the flood came soon after his death, so he lived up to his name. So, if I remember correctly, it's like the same year he died, like if you chart it out.
Huh.
So it's pretty interesting. All right, and then just to wrap up, one scholar says he died 7 days before the flood.
Wow.
It's a little harder to nail that one down. They claim that's what Genesis 7:10 is talking about when they say after 7 days. But I don't know if I can make that case. But Bishop Ussher claims it was in the same year as the flood. Bishop Ussher was the guy who tried to chart back and find out exactly what date the creation of the world took place, and he found it to be 4004 BC. And he's like, sorry, I couldn't get the exact time.
It's okay, man.
I don't know that the creation was exactly 4004 because, again, if you take into account the different calendars, so if you're operating a 365-day year as opposed to a fixed...
into account that or no?
I doubt it, because the other issue a lot of those early guys did when they were swapping calendars around, there was no year zero. So technically Jesus was born like anywhere from 3 to 6 years BC, once you shake all those out. So there's a lot of issues with the calendar where they're not exactly right. But they did what they could. All right, verse 28, Lamech lives 180 years, has a son named Noah, whose name means rest and comfort. The root is derived from the word named comfortable. Lamech lives 595 more years, and in total he lives 777 years, which is just cool.
Yeah, sorry.
All right, Noah lives 500 years. He has 3 sons. Ham is the younger son, so we know they're not triplets. Shem is 100 years old, 102 years after the flood, so he would have been born around that time. And so we can kind of figure out some of those details, even though they're not specifically stated. We just do a little bit of math, and we can track that down. So anyway, that is Genesis chapter 5 in its most interesting form. I am sure you were riveted by that. Now, Genesis 6 is going to talk about the sons of God coming down unto the daughters of men. Okay? And again, think of all that we've looked at. Shem is after the image of Adam, who is after the image of God. So you follow that. And then Cain, you could, not so much. All right? And so here's, oh man, I got the wrong slide. Anyway, we'll cover that tomorrow. All right? So we'll start off with that later on. So anyway, that's just kind of some hints. Tonight, your assignment is to read the article I assigned. And then I would like you to also read up to page 10. Actually, correction, page 11. Read up to page 11 in your syllabus.